The morning Jane Merritt rode into Caldwell, Kansas, she had 43 cents in her pocket, a horse with a cracked shoe, and a letter that told her the man she had traveled 800 miles to marry was already dead. She sat on the buckboard of the stage that had brought her the final leg from Wichita, her travel trunk strapped behind her, her hands folded neatly in her lap as though the very posture of composure could hold the world together. The driver, a weathered man named Cooley with a nose like a bent horseshoe nail, had read the notice on the post board outside the stage office and told her himself, hat in hand, his voice low and careful the way men spoke to women they thought might shatter. George Pratt, cattle rancher, age 41, had been struck dead by a fever 3 weeks prior to her arrival. His foreman had posted the notice to the stage line in Wichita, hoping to stop the woman who had answered Pratt's advertisement before she made the journey in vain. The notice had arrived in Wichita the morning after the stage carrying Jane had already departed. 3 weeks. She had been traveling 3 weeks from Virginia, through Tennessee, across Missouri, riding rail and stage, and once, memorably, the flatbed of a lumber wagon through a stretch of muddy Missouri road, all to arrive at a dust-choked Kansas cattle town to find out she had nowhere to go. She stepped down from the stage with the dignity of a woman who had survived harder things than this, though at the moment she was not entirely certain that was true. She was 24 years old, lean and dark-haired, with gray eyes that had a quality of stillness to them, like the surface of a deep well. Her dress was blue wool, practical and travel-worn, and her boots were good Virginia leather now caked with the red clay of a dozen different roads. Caldwell in the spring of 1878 was a town that smelled of cattle and ambition. The Kisham Trail passed near enough that the whole place had built itself around the commerce of cattle drives, and there were drovers and cowboys and merchants and gamblers all mixed together on the main street like a stew that had been left on too long. The saloons were doing business even at this hour of the morning, and somewhere down the block, a man was arguing loudly with a mule. Jane stood on the boardwalk with her trunk at her feet and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was not going to cry. She had cried in Virginia when her father's farm had finally gone under after 3 bad harvests. She had cried in Tennessee when she had handed her sister the last of the money she had been saving for emergencies and told her to use it for the children. She had used up most of her crying before she ever got on the first stage, and what remained of her reserves she intended to keep for something that truly warranted them. What she needed right now was work, a meal, and a plan. The general store was the obvious first stop. A woman who looked like she might know everyone in town and their business besides was stacking bolts of calico fabric in the window display. Her name, Jane would learn, was Mabel Fitch, and she was the wife of the store's owner and the closest thing Caldwell had to a central nervous system of information. Mabel took one look at Jane coming through the door and said, "You are the woman from Virginia, aren't you? George Pratt's intended." "I was," Jane said simply. "I am afraid I no longer have that distinction." Mabel set down her bolt of calico and pressed her lips together in the particular way of a woman who is rearranging her understanding of a situation. "Well," she said after a moment. "Well, that is a hard thing. Come in and sit down. I'll put the kettle on." It was over that cup of tea, with the morning light coming through the store windows and the dust of Caldwell floating peacefully in the beams, that Mabel told Jane about the Chandler ranch. "Ira Chandler runs about 3,000 acres east of town," Mabel said, wrapping both hands around her own cup. "Good man. Honest as the day is long, which out here is saying something because the days are very long. He lost his cook and housekeeper to a marriage last fall, a girl named Lucy who went off with a drummer from St. Louis, and he has been managing on his own ever since, which by all accounts means he and his 2 ranch hands have been eating salt pork and pan bread for 6 months. "You are suggesting I might apply for the position," Jane said. "I am suggesting you might do worse," Mabel replied. "The pay is fair, the work is honest, and Ira Chandler is not the sort of man who would give a woman any trouble. His mother raised him right. She paused and then added, with the particular tone of a woman planting a seed, "He is also 28 and has never been married, which is a different kind of information that I leave entirely to you to do with as you will." Jane looked at her tea. She thought about the 43 cents in her pocket. She thought about the long road back to Virginia and everything she had left behind there, which was mostly debt and grief. She thought about her sister's children and the money she had hoped to send back once she was established. "How do I find the Chandler Ranch?" she said. The road east out of Caldwell ran straight for 2 miles, and then curved south along a ridge of low hills before dropping down into a wide basin where the grass grew thick, and the creek ran clear even in the dry season. Jane made the journey in the afternoon, having spent the morning arranging for her trunk to be held at the general store, and having eaten a meal at the town's small restaurant that cost her 30 of her 43 cents, and left her feeling both better and more mathematically anxious than before. She borrowed Mabel's wagon and horse for the trip, with a promise to return it by evening, and she drove out along the eastern road with the Kansas spring wind blowing the dust sideways and the prairie stretching around her in every direction like an enormous golden sea. The Chandler Ranch came into view gradually, the way things did on the open plains. First a line of cottonwood trees marking the creek, then the dark shapes of cattle in the distance, then the roof of a barn, then the house itself, a solid 2-story structure built from timber and native stone that had the look of something constructed to last. There was a man working in the yard when she drove in through the gate. He was bent over a fence post, driving it into the ground with a post maul, and he did not look up immediately when she brought the wagon to a stop. He was tall, she noticed, with the kind of lean build that came from hard physical work rather than simply being thin. His hat was pushed back on his head, and when he finally straightened and looked at her, she saw a face that was square-jawed and sun-bronzed, with dark brown eyes that took her in with a directness that was not rude but was entirely without pretense. "Can I help you?" he said. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. It was the tone of a man who was waiting to understand what kind of situation this was before he committed to a particular response. "I am looking for Ira Chandler," Jane said. "You have found him," he said, setting the post maul down. "My name is Jane Merritt. I have just arrived in Caldwell from Virginia. I was intended to be married to George Pratt, but I have arrived to find that is no longer possible. Mabel Fitch at the general store told me that you are in need of a cook and housekeeper. I am applying for the position." He looked at her for a long moment in the way of a man who was accustomed to assessing situations quickly and who did not feel any social pressure to fill a silence with noise. Then he pulled his hat off and held it in his hands, which she noticed was an unconscious gesture of respect. "I am sorry about Pratt," he said. "He was not a bad man." "Thank you," she said. "You have references?" he asked. "I can write to my previous employer in Virginia. I managed the household for the Aldrich family for 4 years before I answered Mr. Pratt's advertisement. In the meantime, I am willing to cook dinner tonight so that you can judge for yourself." Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement but adjacent to it. "That is a practical offer," he said. "I am a practical woman." He settled his hat back on his head. "Well, Miss Merritt, I will show you the kitchen." The kitchen was, as Mabel had implied without quite saying, a disaster of bachelor proportions. There was a cast iron stove that was functional but encrusted, a table that served as both food preparation surface and general storage for everything from harness parts to a broken compass, and a supply of ingredients that consisted primarily of salt pork, dried beans, coffee, flour, lard, and a sack of cornmeal that had developed a concerning resident population in one corner. Jane stood in the doorway and surveyed it with the expression of a woman who had been handed harder problems than this and had solved them through the application of systematic effort. "Do you have any eggs?" she asked. "The chickens are out back," Ira said from behind her. "Butter. There is a crock in the cellar. I think onions, dried peppers, anything of that nature. There may be some dried onion in the pantry. There is definitely some hardtack that I have been afraid to inspect too closely." She turned and looked at him. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms folded, watching her with those direct brown eyes, and she had the sense that he was a man of few words, but that the words he did use were chosen with some care. "I will need to make a list for the general store," she said. "But tonight I can work with what is here. Could you tell your men that dinner will be served at 6 o'clock? "Yes," he said, and then, after a pause, "Are you sure you want this position, Miss Merritt? Caldwell is not Virginia. This ranch is not an easy life." She met his gaze steadily. "I did not travel 800 miles looking for an easy life, Mr. Chandler. I came looking for a good one." He held her gaze for a moment and then nodded, just once, with the gravity of a man who had heard something that meant more than the words on the surface of it. "Dinner at 6, he said, and went back to his fence post. The two ranch hands were a young man named Tommy Briggs, 19 and gap-toothed and enthusiastic about everything, and an older Mexican vaquero called Diego Reyes, who had been working cattle across Texas and Kansas for 15 years, and who spoke with a formal courtesy that Jane found immediately appealing. They both looked at the plate of beans stewed with salt pork and dried onion, and the pan bread she had made from scratch with a kind of reverence that told her more about the previous 6 months of their diet than anything they might have said. Ira Chandler ate without comment for several minutes and then said, "This is very good." "Thank you," Jane said. "The bread especially," he added, and looked briefly surprised at himself for having offered the additional compliment. Tommy said, enthusiastically, "Miss, I do not want to be indelicate, but this is the best meal I have eaten since Christmas, and at Christmas we had beans and pan bread too, so the comparison is not as flattering to the previous cook as I would like it to be, if you take my meaning." Diego smiled into his coffee cup. Jane said she would need the position to be formalized before she could commit to a start date, and so after dinner she and Ira sat at the kitchen table, the dishes washed and stacked, the ranch hands gone to the bunkhouse, and negotiated the terms of her employment with a mutual straightforwardness that both of them seemed to find comfortable. The pay was $12 a month, room and board included, with Sundays free except for the morning meal preparation. She would have a room in the main house, the spare bedroom on the ground floor that had been used for storage and would need to be cleared. "Do we have an agreement?" Ira asked at the end. "We have an agreement," Jane said. She drove back to Caldwell in the blue evening with the stars beginning to appear over the Kansas prairie and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that might have been the beginning of solid ground under her feet. She moved out to the ranch the following morning. It took her the better part of 3 days to bring the kitchen into a state that satisfied her, and another day after that to organize the house in a way that made functional sense. And Ira Chandler during this period was largely absent, occupied with the daily work of the ranch, which in the spring of 1878 meant preparing for the cattle drives that would begin coming up the Kishom Trail in a matter of weeks. Caldwell was a receiving town for the drives, and the business of the entire region would pivot on the arrival of the Longhorns from Texas. But he was present at meals, all 3 of them, every day, and Jane discovered that dinner in particular had become the punctuation mark of her day in a way she had not anticipated. He was not a talkative man, Ira Chandler, but he was an attentive one, and she noticed that he listened to everything that was said at the table with a quality of focus that was unusual. He asked questions that were specific and thoughtful. He remembered things. The 3rd evening, she mentioned in passing that she had noticed the root cellar door had a broken hinge, and the following morning the hinge was fixed, without ceremony or comment. She found herself thinking about him during the day in the way you thought about a problem you had not yet solved, which was to say with a frequency that she initially attributed to the strangeness of her situation, and then, after about 2 weeks, stopped being able to explain away so easily. It was Tommy who first said anything, because Tommy was 19 and gap-toothed, and entirely without the social filter that would have prevented a more experienced man from speaking. He said it to Diego, but within Jane's hearing, as she was hanging laundry on the line behind the house. "Diego, do you reckon Mr. Chandler has noticed that Miss Merritt is beautiful?" Diego, who was mending a bridle nearby, said, "I reckon Mr. Chandler has noticed quite a number of things, Tommy. The question is what he intends to do about them." Jane kept hanging laundry and did not say a word, and later that evening she noticed that Ira poured her coffee before he poured his own, which he had not done in the first week, and she thought about that rather more than was strictly reasonable. The cattle drives began arriving in May, and Caldwell transformed. The main street filled with drovers and cowboys, trail-worn and loud, men who had been riding with longhorns for 6 or 8 weeks up from Texas, and who arrived in town with the energy of a dam breaking. The town's population seemed to double overnight, and the saloons and restaurants and boarding houses all thrummed with the particular chaos of commerce and release. Ira's ranch was not directly on the trail but near enough that drovers sometimes came to him for grazing rights, and there were several days in that first month when she cooked for 8 or 10 men instead of 4, and she found that she did not mind it. She liked having a large table to manage. She liked the system and the rhythm of it. One afternoon, when a large crew of trail hands was at the ranch for grazing negotiations, a drover named Cal Briggs, no relation to Tommy, sat himself down at the kitchen table while she was working and started making conversation of a sort that had too much sideways meaning in it for her comfort. He was not precisely threatening, but he was a man who seemed to have a limited understanding of the word no, and when she asked him to let her work in peace and he did not move, she felt the particular cold clarity of a woman who has assessed a situation and is deciding on the most efficient response. She did not need to make that decision, because Ira came through the kitchen door at that moment, and something in the way he looked at Cal Briggs changed the temperature of the room immediately. He did not raise his voice. He simply said, "Briggs, the men are waiting on the grazing numbers," and held the door open, and there was something in the set of his jaw and the stillness of him that communicated a depth of intention that made Briggs stand up with a speed that suggested he understood the subtext entirely. After Briggs had gone, Ira stood in the kitchen for a moment. He looked at Jane. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am fine," she said. "Thank you. I am sorry that happened." "Men like that happen everywhere," she said. "I am accustomed to managing them." "You should not have to be," he said, with a quiet directness that made the words land differently than a simpler reassurance would have. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the kitchen was very quiet for a moment. And then Tommy came crashing through the back door asking if there was any more coffee, and the moment ended. But Jane thought about it for a long time afterward, lying in her room with the prairie wind moving the curtains, thinking about the way Ira Chandler had said those words, and what they might mean from a man who said very few. It was Diego who told her more about him, in the easy way of a man who had worked alongside someone for years, and felt that plain facts were not betrayals. He told her one evening while she was shelling peas on the back porch, and he was smoking his evening pipe, that Ira had come out from Missouri at 22, with a small inheritance and a very clear head about what he wanted to build. He had bought the land cheap in a season when other men were leaving, when the weather had been bad for 3 years running and the cattle prices had dropped, and he had worked it alone for a year before he had the money to hire anyone. He was a man who trusted slowly and held on once he did. "He has never been in love?" Jane asked, and then felt the boldness of the question and added, "I am asking simply because Mabel mentioned he had not married." Diego drew on his pipe and sent a ring of smoke out into the evening. "There was a woman in Wichita some years ago. She decided Kansas was not what she wanted. She went back east." He paused. He did not speak of it much, but I think it taught him to be careful. Jane shelled peas and thought about a man who had learned to be careful and what it might take to be worth the risk to such a man. She had been at the ranch 6 weeks when the letter arrived from her sister in Virginia. It was not a long letter, and it was not a good one. Her sister's husband was ill, the kind of ill that did not easily get better, and the farm was struggling, and the children were young, and would Jane possibly be able to send something when she could? There was no pressure in the letter. Her sister was not that kind of woman, but the space between the words was full of the kind of worry that Jane understood in her bones. She sat with the letter for a long time that evening. The $12 a month she earned was enough for her room and board and a small amount left over, but sending money home would mean very little margin, and she turned the numbers around in her head the way she always had, looking for the arrangement that worked, and found it thinner than she would have liked. She was sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, the letter in front of her, when Ira came in from the barn. He saw her face and stopped. "Bad news," he said. "My sister," Jane said, and then stopped, because she had not intended to say anything at all. There was something about the directness of his concern, the immediate quality of his attention, that sometimes made her say things she had not planned. He sat down across from her without being asked. "Tell me," he said, and she found that she did. She told him about Virginia, about the farm that had gone under, about the years of managing on the edge of enough, about the sister and the husband and the children, and the particular arithmetic of care that was very hard to balance when you were 800 miles away and earning $12 a month. He listened the whole time without interrupting, which was consistent with everything she knew about him, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way of a man who was thinking rather than simply pausing. "I should have told you this when we arranged the terms," he said. "I have been meaning to hire a second hand for the spring work, a position I would normally pay $10 a month. Tommy and Diego have been splitting the work between them, but it is more than 2 men should carry through a drive season. If you are willing to help with the additional bookkeeping and correspondence that goes with the ranch management, things I have been handling poorly on my own, I would increase your wage to $18 a month." She looked at him. "Is that a real need, or are you manufacturing one to be generous?" "It is a real need," he said, meeting her gaze without flinching. "My accounts have been a confusion since Lucy left. I have 3 grazing contracts that I cannot find the supporting correspondence for. The ledger is approximately 8 weeks behind. I am a man who is competent with cattle and terrible with paper." She looked at him for another moment and then said, "Show me the ledger." It was, as he had indicated, a significant problem, but it was also an interesting one, the kind of organized chaos that she had a particular talent for straightening, and she felt the familiar satisfaction of a task that matched her skills, like a key finding the right lock. "I can have this current within a month," she said, "and I will keep it current afterward." $18 then, he said, and put his hand across the table. She shook it, and his hand was warm and dry and very steady, and she was perhaps a half-second longer releasing it than was strictly necessary. She wrote to her sister that night with better news. June brought the full heat of the Kansas summer, and with it, a series of days that seemed to compress time into long golden hours of work and heat, and the smell of dust and grass. Jane had settled into the rhythm of the ranch so completely that she sometimes forgot she had arrived as a stranger. She knew the names of all the cattle dogs. She knew which board on the back porch creaked and which window stuck in the heat. She knew that Ira took his coffee black in the morning and with a small amount of sugar in the evening, and that he read for half an hour before bed every night by the lamp in the front room, and that when something was on his mind, he had a habit of standing at the kitchen window and looking out at the dark yard with his hands in his pockets. She knew all of this because she was observant by nature, but she also knew it because she had been paying attention to him specifically, and she had been paying attention to him specifically because of something she was finding increasingly difficult to describe as anything other than what it was. She was in the garden one afternoon, in the kitchen garden she had planted in the first weeks that was now producing with the generosity of well-tended soil and good summer rain, when Ira came around the side of the house with a purpose in his stride that meant something had happened. "There is a problem with the south fence line," he said. 2 sections down, cattle in the Miller pasture. I am going to need Tommy and Diego both, and I will be back late. I'll keep supper warm, she said, straightening from the garden with a handful of green beans. He stopped and looked at her for a moment in the way that had become familiar, the look that lasted just a fraction longer than a purely practical exchange required. He said, "You have dirt on your face." "I have been gardening," she said, with a composure she did not entirely feel. "I know," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "It suits you." He walked away before she could respond, and she stood in the garden holding her green beans and thinking that Ira Chandler was going to be the end of her careful management of her own feelings if he kept doing things like that. He came back late, as he had said, and found supper waiting and warm, and when he sat down at the table and looked at the plate she set in front of him, he looked at it for a moment with an expression she could not quite read and then looked up at her. "You waited up," he said. "The food needed to be served correctly," she said. "Jane," he said, and then stopped. It was the first time he had used her given name. She had been Miss Merritt for 6 weeks and the shift was small but unmistakable, and they both heard it. "Yes," she said, very carefully. He seemed to reconsider whatever he had been going to say and said instead, "Thank you for supper." "You are welcome," she said, and went to the kitchen and stood at the sink and pressed her cool hands against her warm face and told herself to be sensible. The difficulty with being sensible was that sensible required a clear analysis of the situation, and the situation, as Jane was beginning to understand it, was one in which she had come to a Kansas ranch as a hired housekeeper, and had somehow found, in the space of 6 weeks, a man who was the most genuinely decent person she had encountered in a long time. That was the problem. He was not charming in the conventional sense, not given to flattery or performance, not the kind of man who made easy impressions. He was simply, consistently, without apparent effort, exactly what he appeared to be, and she was finding that quality of authenticity more compelling than anything she had encountered before. She had been in Virginia, briefly engaged to a man named Robert Aldrich, a cousin of her employer's, who had said all the right things in all the right ways, and had eventually decided that a woman with no family money was not a practical choice. That experience had made her suspicious of smooth words and easy charm. It had made her value exactly the kind of blunt, careful, considered attention that Ira Chandler offered without apparently knowing he was offering it. The problem was that she was his housekeeper, and he was her employer, and there was a line there that she was not going to be the one to cross, because crossing it could cost her everything she had rebuilt, and she was not yet in a position to afford that cost. So she was sensible. She was sensible through July, which was hot and productive and full of the work of the ranch and the satisfaction of seeing things run well. She was sensible when they sat together on the front porch in the evenings, sometimes after the men had turned in, when the air had cooled, and the coyotes were singing in the distance, and they talked about nothing in particular in the comfortable way of two people who had learned each other's company. She was sensible when he came to the kitchen one rainy afternoon and watched her bake bread, and they ended up in a conversation about Missouri and Virginia that lasted 2 hours and covered everything from the politics of Reconstruction to the best method of preserving peaches. She was sensible. And then one August morning Mabel Fitch arrived at the ranch in her husband's wagon with a basket of peaches from her own tree and a particular expression on her face that Jane had learned to read as the arrival of significant information. They sat on the front porch with coffee, and Mabel said, with the directness of a woman who felt that information properly shared was a form of kindness, "I want you to know that Pauline Sharp has arrived in Caldwell." Jane waited. "She is a widow from Wichita. Husband died last winter, left her with a good amount of money and a desire to relocate. She is staying at the boarding house. She is, by all accounts, a very attractive woman." Jane continued waiting. "She asked me this morning who owned the Chandler ranch," Mabel said, and looked at Jane over the rim of her coffee cup. I am telling you this because I believe you have a right to know, and because I have been watching you and Ira Chandler for 2 months, and I am of the firm opinion that something is happening there that the two of you are too careful to acknowledge." Jane looked out at the prairie. "I work for him, Mabel." "You do," Mabel agreed. "And Pauline Sharp does not, which gives her a freedom of action that you have decided not to claim for yourself, which is your right entirely. But I want you to have the full information before you continue making that decision." It was, Jane thought later, a masterclass in the delivery of unwelcome news. Mabel Fitch had said nothing improper, had suggested nothing specific, had offered only facts and the observation that facts had consequences. And yet the conversation left Jane sitting on the front porch after Mabel's wagon had disappeared down the road with a very clear picture of a future she had not previously allowed herself to fully imagine, and a very acute sense of what it would mean to lose it by default. She thought about Diego's words. He did not speak of it much. "But I think it taught him to be careful." A man who was careful could be very easily not reached by a woman who was also being careful. They could both be so careful that they ended up standing on opposite sides of an uncrossable distance, perfectly preserved and entirely alone. She was still thinking about this when Ira came in for the noon meal, and she set his food in front of him with rather more force than usual, and he looked at the plate, and then looked at her with the attention of a man who had learned to notice small things. "Something wrong?" He said. "No," she said, and then, because she was apparently done with being entirely sensible, said, "Mabel Fitch came by this morning." "I saw her wagon," he said. "She told me there is a widow in town named Pauline Sharp who has expressed an interest in the area." Ira picked up his fork and looked at his food and said, without inflection, "Is that so?" "She was apparently asking about the ranch," Jane said. "Mabel tells everyone everything," Ira said, which was not a denial of anything but was also not a confirmation of interest. Jane sat down across from him, which was not her usual habit at the noon meal when she typically ate afterward. She sat down and folded her hands on the table and said, with the clarity of a woman who had decided to be done with uncertainty, "Ira." He looked up. "I want to ask you something directly, and I want a direct answer, because I am a person who does better with direct information than with inference." "All right," he said, with a quality of stillness that meant he understood this was a significant moment. "Do you feel anything more than the ordinary regard of an employer for a good employee when it comes to me? Because I am finding it increasingly difficult to be certain about what I feel about my own situation, and if the answer is no, I would like to know that so that I can organize myself accordingly." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a meadowlark was singing in the yard. Ira set his fork down. He looked at her across the table with those steady brown eyes, and she watched him thinking, watched him doing the thing he did where he considered his words with the same care he gave to every decision, and she waited for him the way you waited for something you had already decided you wanted. "The answer is not no," he said. Her heart did something that she had not given it permission to do. She kept her face calm. "Then what is the answer?" she said. "The answer is that you came here in a difficult situation," he said, choosing each word with evident care, "and I gave you employment, and you have been working for me for 2 months, and I am not a man who would use that circumstance to press anything on you, because you deserve to make choices that are fully free. So I have kept my own counsel." "That is a very considerate answer," she said. "It is also an answer that leaves us both in approximately the same position we have been in for 2 months. "Yes," he said, "it does." "I am telling you now," she said, "in the full exercise of my freedom and my own judgment, that the answer on my part is also not no." He looked at her for a long, steady moment. Then he said, "Jane, would you like to ride out to the north pasture with me this afternoon? I want to show you something." It was, by any reasonable interpretation, a very small thing to say after what had just been said, and yet she understood from the way he said it, from the particular quality of his voice, that it was exactly the right thing. He was not rushing. He was not overwhelming. He was offering her a next step that was manageable and honest and entirely him, "Yes," she said, "I would like that." The north pasture was 3 miles from the house, past the creek and up through a stand of cottonwoods, and it sat on a slight elevation that meant you could see for what seemed like forever in every direction, the plains rolling out to the horizon in shades of gold and green with the summer sky immense and blue above it. Ira stopped his horse at the top of the rise and she stopped hers beside him, and they sat there for a moment looking at it. "I come here when I need to remember why I built what I built," he said. "When things are difficult or I am uncertain, I look at this and I remember what it is for." She looked at the land. She looked at the sky. She looked at the way the grass moved in the wind, the whole enormous living world of it. "What is it for?" she said. "A life," he said. "Something real, something that lasts." He paused. "Something to share." She looked at him. He was looking at the plains, and there was something in his profile that was very clear and very certain, a man who had made up his mind. "I want to court you," he said, turning to look at her. "Properly. I want to take you to dinner in town, and to the dance at the Grange Hall in September, and I want there to be nothing informal about any of it. I want it to be a genuine courtship with the full intention of asking you a very serious question at the end of it, if you are willing, and if you find over that time that I am not what you want, then I will accept that, and we will arrange things properly." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Virginia and Robert Aldrich and all the careful, smooth words that had turned out to mean nothing. She thought about 600 miles of stage and rail, and a letter that had told her a plan had failed. She thought about 43 cents and a broken horseshoe and a dust-covered town, and how none of that had been what she had intended, but all of it had brought her here, to this rise above the north pasture beside this man. "I am willing," she said. He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile fully, without reservation, and it changed his face in a way that did something entirely unauthorized to her composure. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon light, and neither of them said much and neither of them needed to. The courtship was, as he had promised, proper and unhurried. He took her to dinner at the hotel restaurant in Caldwell on a Friday evening in late August, and they sat at a corner table with a cloth on it, and he wore his good coat, and she wore the green dress she had brought from Virginia that she had not yet had occasion to wear, and several of the other diners looked at them with the frank interest of a small community observing the development of a local story. Mabel Fitch saw them from across the room and caught Jane's eye and gave her a look of such complete satisfaction that Jane had to study the menu to keep herself from laughing. Ira noticed. "Mabel," he said. "Mabel," Jane confirmed. "She has been waiting for this for approximately 2 months," he said, with a dry humor that she had been discovering was part of him, a quiet vein of it running beneath the seriousness. "Longer than that," Jane said. "She had the idea the day I arrived." "Mabel Fitch is the most effective matchmaker in 3 counties while maintaining the appearance of simply providing information," Ira said. "She is a woman of remarkable talent," Jane agreed. The dinner was excellent, and the conversation was the kind that ranges broadly and easily, and leaves you feeling that 2 hours have passed in 20 minutes. And when he walked her to the wagon afterward and helped her up, he held her hand a beat longer than strictly necessary and looked at her in the lamplight of the street, and she thought she had rarely been looked at so well. The Grange dance in September was a different kind of evening altogether, louder and more crowded, with a fiddler from Texas who played as though the instrument owed him a debt, and a caller who had the lungs of a man determined to be heard in the next county. The community hall was full of ranch families and townspeople and drovers who were still in the area, and the floor was alive with the particular joy of people who worked hard and knew how to celebrate. Ira danced with her 3 times, which in 1878 in a Kansas community hall was a fairly explicit declaration of interest that everyone in the room noted, and which Tommy Briggs interpreted with such enthusiasm that Diego had to lay a hand on his arm to prevent him from making a comment. He was not, it emerged, a graceful dancer in the technical sense, but he was a careful one, paying attention to where she was, keeping the rhythm, and there was something about dancing with a man who was paying complete attention to you that was worth more than any amount of grace. They stepped outside halfway through the evening for air, the music coming muffled through the walls, the night sky overhead enormous and salt white with stars. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "When you arrived here in June," he said, "I was not in a situation I would have described as unhappy. I had the ranch, the work, men I trusted. It was a good life. But you asked me what I was building it for, and the honest answer at that moment was that I was not certain anymore. I had a plan once that included a future I had thought was coming, and it turned out not to be, and I had been doing the work without fully answering that question again." She looked at him in the starlight. "You answered it," he said simply. "Without meaning to, just by being here, being the way you are. I wanted you to know that." She turned to face him fully and said, "Ira, I came here with nothing but debt and grief and a second-hand plan, and you gave me a situation that was dignified and fair. But the truth is that I stayed because of you. Not the position, not the money, not the reasonable solution to a practical problem. You." He was very still for a moment, and then he reached out and took her hand, holding it in the way of a man who intended to hold on. "I am going to ask you that serious question soon," he said. "I will be ready for it," she said. He did not ask it that night because he was a man who did not rush, and because there was still something he wanted to do first. 2 weeks later, in early October, he came into the kitchen on a Sunday morning when she was making breakfast, and he had a letter in his hand and an expression she had not seen on him before, slightly uncertain in a way that was touching precisely because it was rare. "I wrote to your sister," he said. She turned from the stove. "You wrote to Clara." "I wrote to her 2 weeks ago. I introduced myself and told her who I was and what I had and what my intentions were toward you, and I asked for her blessing on the understanding that you have no living father. I received her reply yesterday." He held up the letter. Jane crossed the kitchen and took the letter and read it, and Clara had written in the particular voice she always used when she was feeling something strongly, the voice that started formal and then grew warm, and the letter said that she was glad, that she was genuinely glad, and that she hoped Jane had found something worth the long road to find it. Jane lowered the letter and looked at him. "You wrote to Clara," she said again, because she needed a moment to absorb the fact of it, the consideration it represented, the deliberateness of a man who thought about what was right and then did it. "She is your family," he said. "It mattered." She stepped forward and took his face in her hands and kissed him, and it was the first time, and it was completely unambiguous, and he stood very still for one breath, and then kissed her back with the whole honest warmth of a man who had been waiting with great patience for exactly this. From the kitchen doorway, where Tommy Briggs had unfortunately chosen this moment to appear requesting coffee, there came the sound of a young man retreating with what sounded very much like suppressed whooping, followed by Diego's voice from the yard saying, with considerable composure, "Tommy, come help me with the horses." Jane and Ira stood in the kitchen with their foreheads together, both of them laughing in the particular helpless way of people who are very happy. "I have a question to ask you," he said when they had recovered. "I know," she said. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." They were married in November 1878 in Caldwell at the small Methodist church on the north end of the main street. Mabel Fitch organized most of it, which was exactly as she had apparently intended from the beginning, and she did so with the efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for the opportunity. The wedding was a simple thing but a full one, with the community hall afterward and the fiddler from Texas again, and more people than Jane had expected, because it turned out that in the months she had been on the Chandler ranch she had made more connections in Caldwell than she had realized. The ranching families who had come for meals and grazing negotiations, the women from church who had begun including her, Diego and Tommy and their families, Mabel and her husband, the restaurant owner and his wife. She stood in the church in a dress that Mabel had helped her make from ivory wool that Clara had sent from Virginia, along with a small parcel of lavender, and a note that said she wished she could be there, but that she was there in every way that mattered, and she was. Ira stood at the altar and watched her come down the aisle with the expression of a man seeing exactly what he had hoped for, and she thought she had never been looked at with such completeness in her life. The preacher said the words. They said the words back. Ira placed a ring on her finger that had been his grandmother's, a simple gold band that he had kept in a box in the top drawer of his desk without knowing why until now. When the preacher said he could kiss his bride, he did so, and Tommy Briggs cheered so loudly that the candles flickered. The winter that followed was the first winter Jane had spent in a long time feeling genuinely at rest. The Kansas winters were hard, the wind cutting and the cold serious, but the ranch was solid and the house was warm, and there was a deep pleasure in the closing of a day when you had worked hard and eaten well, and the person you had chosen to build your life with was sitting across from you by the fire. She continued the accounts and the correspondence, because she was better at it than he was and they both knew it, and she expanded the kitchen garden's plan for the coming spring and wrote letters to Clara every 2 weeks, and received them back with news that her sister's husband was improving slowly but genuinely, which was the best news she had received in years. Ira had a quality she continued to discover all through that winter, the quality of a man who grew. He was not a static person. He was curious and he thought about things, and he changed his understanding when he encountered better evidence. And conversations with him had the quality of genuine exchange rather than the performance of exchange. He told her about Missouri and his father, a farmer who had worked himself to death on land that never quite paid, and how that had shaped his determination to build something that would last. She told him about Virginia and her mother, who had died when Jane was 16, and the years after of managing for a father who was capable but distracted, and the sister who had been her closest companion and her greatest responsibility. They told each other the things that mattered through those long winter evenings, and each telling was a form of trust given and received. And by the time the spring came again, Jane felt she knew him in the way that you knew something you had built yourself, from the inside out. Spring of 1879 brought new work and new growth. The kitchen garden expanded to twice its previous size, and Jane had begun selling preserves and baked goods to the general store in Caldwell, an arrangement that Mabel had proposed with her characteristic combination of businesslike practicality and personal satisfaction. It was not a large income, but it was hers in a distinct way, and she found the independence of it valuable in a manner she appreciated. The ranch was growing. Ira had purchased a small additional parcel of land to the east over the winter, a decision he had made after extended discussion with Jane, whose judgment he had come to rely on for the kind of long-term thinking that the accounts made possible. Diego had taken on an additional responsibility, training a young horse they had acquired from a departing homesteader, a task he approached with the focused expertise of a man who understood horses the way other people understood language. Tommy Briggs, in the spring of 1879, fell in love with a girl from town named Alice Cutter, the schoolteacher's daughter, and conducted his courtship with a combination of profound earnestness and spectacular awkwardness that Jane found enormously endearing, and that Ira observed with a dry humor that was one of the great pleasures of knowing him. He left flowers on her doorstep 3 days running, Ira told Jane one evening. On the 4th day her father came to the door and Tommy was so startled he dropped the flowers and ran. And yet she is still speaking to him, Jane said. She finds it charming, apparently, Ira said. Alice Cutter is either a very forgiving woman or she has excellent judgment about what a man is under the awkwardness. Rather like a woman who came to Kansas Cattle Ranch with 43 cents and hired on as a cook, Jane said. He looked at her with that particular expression that was still, after months of marriage, capable of doing something entirely unauthorized to her composure. Rather like that, he agreed. In May of 1879, Jane understood that she was expecting a child. She sat with the knowledge for a few days, which was partly practical caution, waiting to be certain, and partly the simple private pleasure of holding something precious before you shared it with the world. She told Ira on a Sunday evening, sitting on the front porch in the last of the spring light, while the meadowlarks were singing in the yard. She said it simply and without elaborate announcement, because that was how they spoke to each other, and she watched his face as the information arrived and settled. He was very still for a moment. Then he reached across and took her hand and held it, and when he looked at her, his expression was the plainest, most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a man's face, an emotion so complete and undisguised that she felt it as a physical thing in her chest. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling all right?" "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said, and brought her hand to his lips and held it there for a long moment. And that was all he said, and it was entirely enough. He told Tommy and Diego the following morning, and Tommy's reaction was predictably enthusiastic, and Diego nodded with the grave, warm satisfaction of a man who understood the weight of continuity. Mabel Fitch appeared at the ranch within 2 days of hearing, which suggested that either Ira or Tommy had mentioned it in town, and she arrived with a basket of things that were useful for expecting women, and a series of very practical opinions about physicians and timing and diet, all of which Jane received with genuine gratitude because Mabel Fitch's practical opinions were generally reliable. The summer of 1879 moved around Jane with the particular quality of a summer that has stakes. She continued working through most of it, because she was healthy and the work was satisfying, and she was not a woman who could be still when there was something useful to be done. Ira fretted about this in a quiet and contained way that she found both touching and occasionally exasperating. One afternoon in July, she caught him watching her from the barn doorway while she was weeding the kitchen garden, and she said, "I am weeding, not climbing a cliff face." And he said, "I am simply observing." And she said, "You have been simply observing for 3 days running, and I can feel it from across the yard." And he walked over and crouched down beside her in the garden and said, with a frankness that disarmed her entirely, "I worry about you." That is not a complaint or a criticism. It is simply what is true. "I worry about you and the child, and I do not entirely know what to do with that except try to be useful." She looked at him, this man who had been carved by practicality and loss into someone honest and careful and real, and she felt an affection so large it was almost uncomfortable. "You are useful," she said. "You are enormously useful. You fixed the hinge on the cellar door before I asked you to. You wrote to my sister. You built me a better work table for the kitchen last month without being asked. You are the most practically loving person I have ever known." He looked at the garden for a moment. "I do not always know how to say what I mean." "I know," she said. "You show it instead." "I learned to read that language some time ago." He looked at her with those steady brown eyes and said, "Good." She kissed him on the cheek and went back to her weeding, and he stayed and helped pull weeds without speaking further, and it was one of the best afternoons of her life. In August, she had a long and detailed letter from Clara that said her husband was well enough now to work the farm again, that the children were growing, that the money Jane had been sending had made a real difference, and that she was saving what she could to perhaps, one day, make the journey to Kansas, because she wanted to see what kind of life her sister had built in this strange and faraway place. Jane read this letter twice and then once more, and then she went and found Ira and read him the relevant portion, and he said, "Write back and tell her to come as soon as she is able. There is room." He said it with the complete simplicity of a man who had not needed to think about it, and she loved him very precisely at that moment for the ease of it. Their son was born in October of 1879, a month before their first anniversary, in the room with the window that looked out over the north pasture. The birth was attended by the doctor from Caldwell, a steady and competent woman named Dr. Helen Marsh, who had come out from Ohio 2 years prior and established the only medical practice in the county, and by Mabel Fitch, who was there because she was the kind of woman who was where she was needed. Ira spent the labor in the front room with Diego, both of them largely silent, and Tommy paced in the yard with the energy of a young man who did not know what to do with anxiety and had not yet learned Diego's particular talent for stillness. The baby arrived in the early morning, healthy and loud, with a full expression of opinions about the situation that filled the house, and when Ira was allowed into the room and saw Jane lying in the bed with their son in her arms, he stopped in the doorway for a moment with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. He crossed to the bed and sat beside her and looked at the baby with the complete focus of a man encountering something extraordinary, and then looked at her. "He is perfect," he said. "He is very loud," she said. "That too," he said, and reached out and carefully, with enormous gentleness, touched his son's small fist. They named him William James Chandler, William for Ira's father and James for Jane's, and he was called Will, and he had his father's dark eyes and his mother's quality of attention, and from the first days of his life he seemed to look at everything as though he was sorting it out, which Jane felt was a deeply appropriate Chandler characteristic. The winter after Will's birth was the warmest winter Jane had experienced since coming to Kansas, not in terms of weather but in terms of the quality of their life. There was something about the completion of a family that she had not quite allowed herself to anticipate, and that arrived with more fullness than she had imagined. The house felt different with a baby in it, more inhabited, more alive, and Ira with the baby was a revelation, patient and careful and clearly completely undone by his son in a way he managed with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything. Tommy Briggs married Alice Cutter in December of 1879 in the same Methodist church where Ira and Jane had married, and Jane held Will throughout the ceremony and whispered to him about the proceedings, which he regarded with the solemn attention of a 2-month-old who was doing his best to follow along. The spring of 1880 brought the letter they had been waiting for. Clara was coming. Her husband was well and stable, the farm was managed, the children were old enough for the journey, and she was coming in June with all 3 of them and intended to stay the summer. Jane read the letter at the kitchen table and did not quite cry, but it was a close thing, and Ira sat down across from her and waited the way he always did, attentive and patient, and when she looked up she said, "She is coming in June." "Good," he said. "I want to have the spare room ready and the children can have the Jane," he said. "It will all be managed. We have until June." She smiled because he was right, and because he was always right about these things in the calm, practical way of a man who trusted that problems were solvable and did not see the benefit of anticipating them into crises. "Yes," she said, "we do." There was one difficulty in that spring of 1880, because the Wild West was not simply a place of personal happiness, but also of wider complications. There were tensions along the territory boundaries that spring, disputes between ranchers and homesteaders over water rights and grazing access, the kind of friction that built in dry years when resources were short and men's tempers were shorter. There had been incidents in the county to the north, claims burned, cattle run off, the kind of thing that lived between legal disputes and outright violence and was therefore harder to address than either. Ira was not a man who looked for trouble, but he was also not a man who looked away from injustice, and when a homesteader family named Pell was run off their claim by a group of men working for a larger operation to the west, and the Pells arrived in Caldwell with nothing, it was Ira who went to the county sheriff and presented a formal written complaint on their behalf, having gathered statements from 3 neighbors who had witnessed the harassment over the preceding months. Jane helped him write the complaint, and it was a careful and thorough document that made the legal case in plain language, and the sheriff, a man named Harkins who was conscientious if not always swift, took it seriously. It was not a simple resolution. These things never were in 1880 in Kansas, where the law was present but thin, and the power of large land interests was real and heavy. But the Pells were not run out without contest, and the matter was ultimately settled through a legal process rather than being simply abandoned, which was the best outcome available and better than many homesteaders received. Ira discussed all of it with Jane in the evenings after Will was sleeping, and she had her own opinions that he listened to and incorporated, and she found in those conversations a clarity about what kind of man she had married that she valued deeply. He understood that the system was not always fair, and that his own position of relative security was partly luck and partly the hard work of years, and partly the compound benefit of being a man in a time and place where that mattered enormously, and he was not comfortable simply benefiting from advantages he had not fully earned. "The Pells had the same right to their claim as I had to mine," he said once simply. "Yes," she said. "And they had more difficulty exercising it." "Yes," he agreed. These were not simple conversations and they did not produce simple solutions, but they were honest ones, and she valued the honesty. Clara arrived in June of 1880 with her 3 children, Robert, who was 9, and Eleanor, who was 7, and baby Thomas, who was barely 2. And the reunion between the sisters on the platform at the Caldwell station was the kind of reunion that makes bystanders look away, and then look back, because the emotion of it is both private and irresistibly human. Clara was shorter than Jane and darker, with the same gray eyes and a quality of wiry energy that had kept her going through years of difficulty, and she stood in the yard of the Chandler ranch on her first afternoon there, and looked around at the land and the house and the kitchen garden and the chickens and the men working in the distance, and then looked at her sister. "You built something here," she said. "We built something," Jane said. "Show me the baby." Will at 8 months was a person of considerable views, and he regarded his Aunt Clara with the deep skepticism of a baby who had not yet learned the social grace of hiding his assessments, and then apparently decided she was acceptable and reached for her hair, which she correctly interpreted as a form of high approval. Clara and Ira met with the particular formality of 2 people who were each the most important person in the life of someone they both loved, and who were therefore assessing each other with a thoroughness that they both recognized in each other. Clara said, over dinner that first evening, with the directness of a woman who had been managing hard things for years, "Ira, my sister wrote me a letter when she arrived here telling me about you. She did not say anything romantic, which in her letters means everything. And then she wrote me another letter and each one had more of you in it, and still nothing romantic. And I thought, this is either a man she is developing strong feelings for, or a man she is going to complain to me about. And eventually I understood which one it was." Ira said with the dry humor that Clara appeared to appreciate immediately, "I hope the letters were not a burden." "They were the opposite," Clara said. "Every good letter from someone far away is a gift." She paused and looked at him squarely. "You are good to her." "I endeavor to be," he said. "She is the best person I know," Clara said. "Not the most agreeable, not the easiest, but the best. You understand the difference." "I do," he said. "It is why I married her." Jane looked at her plate and felt the warmth of 2 people she loved recognizing each other, and thought that this too was a form of belonging she had not expected to find so completely. The summer of 1880 was one of the best of Jane's life. Clara and her children filled the house with a different kind of energy, and the cousins were introduced to the rhythms of ranch life with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Robert taking to the horses with an immediate passion that delighted Diego, Eleanor developing a fascination with the kitchen garden, and following Jane around with questions, and little Thomas being carried on every available hip. There was a day in July when Jane stood on the front porch in the evening and looked out at the yard where Ira was sitting in the grass with Will in his lap, showing the baby something in his hand, a stone or a beetle, something small and interesting, and Clara sat beside her leaning on the porch railing, and the evening was warm and golden and the meadowlarks were singing, and Clara said quietly, "You are happy." It was not a question. "Yes," Jane said, "completely." "Good," Clara said, and put her arm around her sister's shoulders, and they stood there together in the evening and watched Ira hold up whatever small thing he had found so that his son could see it better, and Will grabbed for it with his whole fist, and Ira laughed. Jane had not heard him laugh like that before, fully and without restraint, and the sound of it was one of the best things she had ever heard. Clara left in September, with tears and promises and a long embrace on the station platform, and she took Jane's own heart a little distance with her as she went. But she also left behind the clear and settled knowledge that the distance between them was not a loss but a holding pattern, that they would see each other again, that the world had gotten smaller in the past 2 years in all the best ways. The autumn of 1880 was productive and peaceful, the ranch doing well, the accounts in order, Will beginning to pull himself upright on furniture, and regard the entire world from his new perspective of partial verticality, with the expression of a boy who was satisfied with the progress. In November, on the evening before their second anniversary, Ira came in from the barn later than usual and found Jane sitting by the fire reading, Will long since asleep in his crib, the house quiet and warm. He sat down in the chair across from her and looked at the fire for a moment and then looked at her. 2 years tomorrow, he said. Yes, she said. I want to tell you something, he said. She put her book down. When you drove into the yard that afternoon in June of 1878, he said, with Mabel Fitch's horse and the question about the cook's position, I thought you were the most composed person I had ever seen in a difficult situation. You had just arrived after an 800-mile journey to find that the plan you had made was gone, and you were standing in my yard asking about a job with the kind of straightforwardness that I had never encountered before in anyone, man or woman. She watched him. I told you we could try dinner, he said. And then I went back to my fence post, and I thought to myself carefully, as I always think about things, that this woman was going to change something. I did not know what. I was being careful, as I always am, but I knew. You knew, she said. Something in the way you looked at the kitchen, he said, with a small dry shift of expression that meant he was quietly amused. Like a general surveying a field, you were going to bring that kitchen into order and there was absolutely nothing it could do about it, she smiled. The kitchen was a genuine disaster. It was, he agreed. And so was I in ways I had not admitted. He paused and the quiet humor left his face, replaced by the earnestness that was always underneath it. You brought everything into order, Jane. Not just the accounts and the kitchen and the garden. Everything. She moved to sit beside him, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned against him and felt the solidity of him, the steadiness that was entirely characteristic, and that she had come to rely on in the deepest way. You did the same for me, she said. A person can travel 800 miles in completely the wrong direction and still arrive exactly where they were meant to be. Is that what happened? He said. That is exactly what happened, she said. He pressed his lips to her hair and they sat by the fire while the prairie wind moved outside and Will slept in his crib and the ranch stood solid around them in the Kansas night. The years that followed settled into the kind of life that is harder to describe than the dramatic moments that precede it, because it is made of ordinary things that are, in their accumulation, extraordinary. Ira expanded the ranch again in 1881, a careful and deliberate expansion, and the conversation over those plans was the kind of partnership that Jane had come to think of as the best version of marriage, two people thinking together toward something neither could have built alone. In 1882, their daughter was born. They named her Clara after the aunt who had written with such warmth and who had never stopped sending letters, and she arrived into the world at the Chandler Ranch with the same quality of strong opinion that had characterized Will's entrance, and the two children regarded each other for the first few days with the mutual assessment of small people deciding where they stood. And then Will, aged 2.5, apparently made up his mind and appointed himself his sister's keeper, which role he took with the seriousness of a very small boy who understood that this was important work. Clara from Virginia came for the christening, just her, leaving her husband with the children and the farm, and she and Jane had 3 days together that were full and warm and deeply satisfying in the way of sisters who have been apart too long and who have things to say that are easier said in the same room. Clara held the baby named after her and looked at her with a wonder that made her eyes bright and said, "This is too much honor, Jane." "It is the right amount," Jane said. "She should know from the beginning that she comes from women who did not give up." Tommy Briggs and his wife Alice had their first child that same year, a boy they named after Diego in a move of such touching fidelity that the old vaquero had to attend to something in the barn for a while after hearing about it. The ranch continued to grow. Jane continued the accounts and the correspondence and the kitchen garden, which by 1883 was producing enough that she had formalized the arrangement with the general store into a real commercial enterprise, small but steady, with preserves and dried goods that were beginning to have something of a reputation in Caldwell and the surrounding area. Mabel Fitch said, with the satisfaction of a woman whose original assessment had been fully vindicated, "I always knew you would find a way to make this place produce more than cattle." "You also always knew quite a lot of other things," Jane said. "I did," Mabel agreed, entirely without apology. In the spring of 1883, Jane found herself thinking about something that had been forming at the edge of her mind for some time. She sat down with Ira one evening after the children were sleeping and said, "I want to talk to you about something." He set down his book and gave her his full attention, as he always did, the quality of focus that still, after 5 years of marriage, had the effect of making her feel that what she was going to say mattered. "I have been thinking about the women in this county who are in the situation I was in when I arrived," she said. "Women who come out here for marriages that do not materialize, or who are widowed, or who arrive with nothing and nowhere clear to go. There is no organized way for them to find employment or housing or resources. They are entirely at the mercy of whoever they happen to encounter first, which is sometimes good luck and sometimes not." Ira watched her. "I want to help start something," she said. "Something organized, a bureau or a society or at minimum a network of women and families who have space and work and are willing to offer it in an organized way rather than randomly. A woman arriving in Caldwell should be able to go to one place and find information about legitimate opportunities." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mabel Fitch." "She is the obvious partner," Jane agreed. "And Dr. Marsh," he said. "She has the institutional standing." "Yes. You will need space and some operational funds. I can contribute to the operational funds. For the space, the church hall might be available on a regular day." She looked at him. He was not offering support, she realized. He was already planning it with her, moving into the details with the practical mind that could not encounter a solvable problem without beginning to solve it. "You are remarkable," she said. "You are the one who had the idea," he said. "You had it half a moment after I said it," she said. The small organization they eventually established, with Mabel Fitch and Dr. Marsh and the preacher's wife and Jane as its founding core, was never large or formal in the institutional sense. It had no official name for some time, being referred to in the community simply as the Ladies' Bureau or sometimes as Jane Chandler's effort, which she found both gratifying and slightly embarrassing. But it had the effect she had hoped for, creating a structured place where women in difficult circumstances could find information and connection, and in some cases employment. And in the years between 1883 and the end of the decade, it helped more women than she could count. It was the work that felt most specifically hers, in a life full of meaningful work, and Ira understood this without her having to explain it, and supported it with the same practical generosity he brought to everything that mattered to her. Their third child, a boy they named Daniel, arrived in 1885, healthy and loud, and Will at 5 regarded him with the experienced air of a boy who had already been through this with Clara and knew what to expect. And Clara at 3 simply tried to immediately adopt him, which Daniel, once he had opinions about it, seemed largely to accept. The ranch by 1885 was a different place from the enterprise that Jane had arrived at in 1878, grown in acreage and staff and capacity, with 3 permanent ranch hands now in addition to Diego and Tommy, and the bookkeeping that Jane managed had become a genuine and substantive operation. She had also, by this point, been helping several neighboring families with their accounts as a paid service, a quiet expansion of her work that had grown from being asked for help and then asked again. Ira watched all of this with the pride of a man who had never believed that the person he loved ought to be less than everything they were capable of being. And this was, Jane thought, one of the qualities she valued most about him, the way he expanded rather than contracted the space available to her. In 1887, Clara from Virginia came for a longer visit, 3 months, with all her children, and the cousins filled the Chandler ranch with the particular chaos and delight of children, who are approximately the same age discovering each other properly for the first time. Will was 7 and serious and gentle. Clara was 5 and opinionated and funny. Daniel was 2 and followed everyone everywhere with the determination of a very small person who refused to be left out. Clara sat on the front porch with Jane on an evening near the end of her visit, the children's voices coming from the yard where Ira had organized some kind of game involving a rope and a barrel that apparently required everyone's full participation, and she said, "Do you remember the letter I got from you in 1878? The first one, after you arrived?" "I remember writing several letters that autumn," Jane said. "The first one, you said the position was adequate and the work was manageable and the country was very flat. You said nothing about the man you were working for except that he was fair." Jane smiled. "That was accurate at the time. You have never been less than honest," Clara said. "But the letters changed, very gradually, and by the time you wrote me in September of 1878 and said, without once using his name, that you had been shown the North Pasture and found it beautiful, I knew." "You knew from that?" Jane said. "Jane, you described a field of grass in 3 paragraphs. That is not the behavior of a woman admiring the landscape." Jane laughed and Clara laughed with her, and from the yard came the sound of Ira's voice saying something patient and clear to a group of children who were all loudly disagreeing with him, and then Tommy's voice joining in and Diego's, and the whole yard full of the noise of people she loved. "I am glad you found him," Clara said when they had stopped laughing. "I am glad the plan that failed led you here." "So am I," Jane said. "Every single day." The years at the end of the 1880s brought the maturation of everything they had built. The ranch was established and respected. The bureau was functioning and doing genuine good. The children were growing into people of character who had their parents' qualities in varying and interesting combinations. Will, at 9, had his father's steadiness and his mother's accounting mind, and was already learning the ranch books as a kind of education that Ira conducted with patient seriousness. Clara, at 7, had her aunt's fierce competence and Jane's gray eyes, and had once organized all the children on the ranch into a system for collecting eggs that was substantially more efficient than the adults' previous method, which Diego had acknowledged with the gravity it deserved. Daniel, at 4, was his own person entirely, cheerful and bold and possessed of an imagination that kept everyone around him permanently off balance in the most delightful way. Ira had gray appearing at his temples by 1888, which Jane found entirely unfair given that she saw no corresponding change in her own mirror, and she told him so, and he said that she was at a minimum 5 years younger than he was, and she said that did not account for the inequity of the arrangement, and he said he would take the matter up with time and see what could be arranged, which made her laugh. They still sat on the front porch in the evening sometimes, in the good weather after the children were in bed, and the coyotes still sang in the distance, and the prairie was still immense and endlessly itself around them, and the meadowlarks were still there in the spring and summer, and the stars over Kansas were the same stars they had sat under 10 years before when Ira had held her hand, and told her he was going to ask her a serious question. One such evening, in the summer of 1888, with the fireflies beginning to appear at the edge of the yard, Jane said, "Do you remember what I said when you showed me the north pasture the first time? You said you had not traveled 800 miles looking for an easy life," he said. "You said you had come looking for a good one. And then you asked if you could court me properly," she said. "I did." "Did you know then what it would become?" she said. He thought about it in the way he thought about everything, with care and honesty. "I knew it would be a life worth building," he said. "I did not know the full shape of it. The children, the bureau. Clara coming out and you and she sitting on this porch in the evenings the way you do. Diego's face when Tommy named his boy after him. I did not know any of the details." "No," she said. "But I knew the person," he said. "I knew you, the kind of person you were, from the first afternoon. And that was enough to know that whatever came would be worth having." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her. And the fireflies moved in the dark yard, and the stars came out over the Kansas prairie. The same stars that had always been there. Over the trail and the town and the ranch and the long grass. Over all the hard and beautiful distance of it. From inside the house, Daniel's voice rose briefly in some nocturnal complaint, and then there was the sound of small feet, and Will's patient older brother voice settling him back, and then quiet. Ira said with the quiet humor that was one of her favorite sounds, "Will is going to be running this ranch before he is 15. He already understands the accounts better than Tommy," Jane said. "Tommy has always preferred horses to numbers," Ira said. "Tommy is a good man who is very happy," Jane said, "which is the best possible outcome for a person." "Yes," Ira agreed, "it is." The night was warm and full of stars. Somewhere east of them, toward the north pasture, a horse moved in the paddock. The windmill at the creek turned slowly in the evening wind with its steady creak that was as much a part of the ranch's voice as anything else. Jane thought about 43 cents, and a letter telling her a plan had failed, and a stage pulling into a dust-covered Kansas town in the spring of 1878, and about the afternoon sun in a kitchen that needed straightening, and about a tall man with a post-mall and brown eyes that did not look away from things, and about all the distance between that moment and this one, which was not really distance at all but a road that had known where it was going even when she had not. She had come 800 miles looking for a good life. She had found, instead, the best one she could have imagined. Around her and Ira, the ranch breathed in the evening, solid and living and theirs, built from the ground up by two people who had each arrived at the same place from different directions and decided, with the particular quiet certainty of people who trust what they know, to stay. The coyotes sang in the prairie dark, and the stars held steady over Kansas. And inside the house the children slept in the rooms of a home that would outlast the people who had built it, passing forward into the future all the good things that had been planted here, in the long grass beside the creek, on the land that Ira had stood on as a young man and decided was worth everything he had to give. And Jane Merritt Chandler sat on her front porch with her husband's arm around her and the whole wide prairie before her, and thought that this, precisely this, was exactly enough.